Howdy. The picture of the day. Earthquake comparison between Europe and the Americas. Um, this is similarly sized, how to put it, a screenshot from Europe, and I didn't zoom in or out. I just took it over to America and screenshotted it again. It's very red. Very red. And also yellow and green and blue. Earthquakes, 7 days, made some half an hour ago. But now to some read through. CERN has been fired up today. I watched it. Nothing happened. Energy, Mass and Light Thunderbolts Project, written by Scott Douglas. Energy, Mass and Light. Actually, it's by Matthias Hüfner. I always felt that science is the domain of people from Oxbridge or Ivy League universities and not for mere mortals. It was a very bad idea. Benoit Mandelbrot. So, a brief history of physics. The social requirement of physics is to study nature's energy supply so that we can derive technical processes from it. At least that was the demand on physics at the time of my studies 50 years ago. Modern physics seemed to be very far removed from this nowadays. To put it bluntly, energy is in moving masses and forces set masses in motion, as Isaac Newton derived from movements of the heavenly bodies. The theory of movements of the masses is summarized under the concept of dynamics. Now an artificial sun, called Sapphire, has risen in the laboratory sky and has finally shattered nowadays split worldview into the macro and microcosm of physics. The all-thought pattern of the symmetry of an expanding closed world which can be described using an equation has had its day. The new way of thinking, a paradigm shift in Thomas Kuhn's sense, is necessary. The world is to be understood as a dynamic process in an open system. In it, dynamic structures over a large range of scales are not symmetrical but are self-similar. If you study historical sources on dynamics and physics, one can recognize different phases after the beginning of the Enlightenment. The 18th century was the century of mechanics. This epoch benefited from the infinitesimal calculus of continuous functions introduced by Newton. The 19th century was the century of research into electricity. As early as 1836, the Italian Fabrizio Mosotti developed the idea of an electromagnetic worldview, which inspired Michael Faraday. This was strengthened by the work of Joseph Larmor and Wilhelm Wien. Even then, it was recognized that masses carry electrical charges and that all forces are of electromagnetic origin. And that all forces are of electromagnetic origin. And that all forces are of electromagnetic origin. However, the theory of electricity developed by James Clerk Maxwell divided physicists into adherents of an electromagnetic ether theory and atomists who favored long-distance gravitational forces. Since at that time one could not yet imagine the difference between bound and free shieldable charge. The first Solvay conference of 1911 in Brussels, initiated by Walter Nernst on the theory of radiation and quantum, was invented to find a compromise between the ether advocates represented by Hendrik Anton Lorentz, who wanted to further develop Maxwell's theory, and the atomists represented by Max Planck and Albert Einstein. The fundamental, fruitful ideas of Planck and Einstein should serve as the basis of our discussions. We can modify or improve them, but we cannot ignore them. It was not recognized at the time that Einstein's idea was less fruitful than assumed, since it went against Maxwell dynamics, and Planck's constant referred only to the action of an electron and was not a natural constant. Compromises in the field of politics are good, because there it is a question of balancing interests. However, science is about knowledge, and its logic is based on two-valued algebra with the values true and false, from which higher mathematics is also derived. The proportional relationships of natural phenomena are particularly interesting for physics because one would like to derive natural constants from them, on which one wants to base the system of units of measurement. This gives the impression that the units of measurement are not social agreements, but have a universally valid objective character. This applies in particular to the speed of light. Planck's constant, the elementary charge, the Boltzmann constant, and the gravitational constant. However, this is highly problematic since these constants are obtained in a measurement process that is only valid within a certain measurement range, and beyond this measurement range there are no longer any guarantees. In the field of optics, the constancy of the speed of light no longer applies because a change in direction of an optical wavefront is only possible as a result of changes in transit time between inside and outside. As a result of changes in transit time between inside and outside. The Doppler effect would also not exist without transit time differences. The proton has a different effect due to its 1836 times greater mass in general. Modern physics has a problem with understanding mass. There is confusion with the concept of matter or force. The concept of matter is not a physical concept, but a philosophical category. Matter includes everything that exists outside of our consciousness. We reflect matter as our consciousness through sense perceptions. We can perceive forces with our senses, so by definition, they are material. Anyone who cannot distinguish between these will never be able to understand physics. I made videos about why things matter in my own way. That's why tears are electromagnetic discharge events, or crying is an electromagnetic discharge event. But anyway, mass, on the other hand, means nothing more than an uncountable quantity. When a farmer sells grain, nobody thinks of buying it by the number of grain kernels. As early as in ancient Egypt, countable equivalents were introduced for the subdivision of mass of grain kernels for comparison using the beam balance. To speak of an increase in mass as a result of acceleration is therefore absurd given the definition of mass. Yeah, you buy rather really slow grains, otherwise they're going to be expensive. The apparent increase in mass that results from the manipulation of Einstein's energy formula is nothing other than a mechanical resistance in the direction of movement, which the either or better the electromagnetic force field opposes to the moving body. On the threshold of the 20th century, another factor influencing physics was added. As a result of industrialization, workers organized themselves into non-church unions. Thus, the Catholic Church saw its power dwindle. Pope Pius X lamented in his 1907 encyclical that science was no longer serving as the handmaid of theology. Yeah. Like I said in the beginning, CERN and these kind of things, they invented things and they really try to believe in it as hard as they can, and it doesn't matter how much it costs. But anyway. Lemaitre's work aimed at reconciling sciences and faith, as he put it. He did this by uniting leading scientists of the 20th century in the Papal Academy of Sciences, thus bringing them back under the control of Church. So the world model he designed from a giant atom was replaced by the Big Bang and further developed in the standard models of the macro and microcosm, which modern physics split into the theory of relativity and quantum mechanics were further developed. Albert Einstein defined energy as the product of mass and the square of the speed of light, which he believed to be a constant. Since in his theory, a ray of light ran like a rigid axle of a railroad car, the imaginary world had to bend like railroad tracks. Max Planck, on the other hand, defined energy as the product of the quantum of impact and frequency, whereby he also declared the quantum of impact to be a natural constant. However, a household hammer drill has a much greater impact than a single electron, and what effect a tsunami wave can have is certainly still remembered by many people. In doing so, these two titans of physics had cemented the split in physics. For if energy in the macrocosm were equal to the energy in the microcosm, then it would follow the mass. That mass would be proportional to the frequency, which contradicts experience. Strangely enough, the majority of the physicists community accepted this contradiction without complaint and sought to unify both theories in a theory of quantum gravity up until the 21st century. It would be easier if we dropped the scholastic idea of the God-given constancy of nature and would took into account the degree of its dynamics and the various scales. The mathematician Benoit Mandelbrot made a major contribution to this. He brought back to our consciousness the ancient knowledge that nature is fractally divided into 4 phases. Until now, the continuity of the infinitesimal calculus had priority over the physical effects at the phase boundaries, where the mathematical description fails because the functions cannot be rectified. But at least in the 20th century, the relativistic view of nature settled the age-old dispute as to whether the sun revolved around the earth or the earth revolved around the sun. Statements by Einstein testify to this, saying that it doesn't matter whether the train or the platform is moving. So Galileo was rehabilitated by Pope John Paul II in 92 after 359 years. Yeah, it's hard sometimes to read in a different language. The thought experiment of Schrödinger's cat, which characterizes the properties of quantum experiments, follows the same line of thought. It describes a cat which vegetates as a zombie in the box, and only the observer decides whether it is alive or dead by opening the box. It is understandable that such and similar statements are disturbing for logically thinking people on one hand, and on the other hand have magically attracted esotericists, which was intended, because the old mystery of the Immaculate Conception of the Virgin had finally had its way. Well, that is still the state of academic science in these days. We can state that the Lemaitre's dream of reconciling science and faith has been fulfilled, at least in theoretical physics. Pope Pius X's commandment, written in his 97 encyclical, was fulfilled, and those who wish to pursue a career should adhere to the dogmas of the academic teaching. The Pontifical Academy of Science monitors the purity of this teaching with an interest-driven peer review system, which now enjoys worldwide influence, but increasing has come under criticism. In the 1980s, the 30-year black hole war broke out between Leonard Susskind, the advocate of quantum theory, and Stephen Hawking, the advocate of theory of relativity, which Hawking ended with the acknowledgement that black holes do not exist, according to the theory, but that the term could be given a new meaning. Meantime, The army of doubters is growing unnoticed. Yeah, I have more than 2,000 videos, I guess. No one cares. The list of non-dissident scientists has grown to over 10,000. Yeah, I'm just a dissident, I'm not a scientist. And their ideas are also becoming more and more diverse, since they mostly appear as lone fighters, which of course severely limits their options. Yeah, think of it. I don't have access to any, like those papers. I either have to buy or I should belong to some institution. I don't. But anyway, undeterred by this, leading academic theorists continue to carry out expensive experiments with dubious outcomes and, in accordance with church guidelines, are even rewarded with Nobel Prizes, although they are diametrically opposed to the idea of Nobel, who decreed that the prize should go to whoever has brought the greatest benefit to society. Does this mean, if I am correct with my mountain water theory, that glaciers are actual volcanoes, they are just not understood yet? They are crypto geysers, and you don't need a glacier to have this. Just a lake or a well on a mountain is enough. Many people's life could be saved. If it's anything, I should probably win the Nobel Prize, despite being not an academic. I don't know. It's just interesting, you know. The decisive experiment based on the tokamak principle, in which a high-temperature plasma is supposed to ignite autonomous nuclear fusion, has been falsifying the theories of particle physics with a constant irregularity for the past 70 years. And at temperatures far above the temperature of the sun. We want to ignite a solar fire on Earth, but our academic science doesn't understand the cosmos. So let's forget about relativity and quantum mechanics for a while and start our thinking at the end of the 19th century with the ether drift experiments. The decisive question is whether light is distributed isotropically or anisotropically as a wave. In other words, the Doppler effect applies to light. Is applicable. Einstein's theory of relativity claimed the opposite. His theory calls for a constant overall speed, but the resulting overall speed decreases with wavelength in the Doppler effect. The Michelson-Morley interferometer experiment was ruled negative, although Dayton Miller later confirmed the inequality at Mount Wilson and fairly accurately determined the Earth's velocity v with the Sun around the center of the Milky Way. Only nobody could do anything with the measured value at that time, since it did not correspond to the expected orbital speed of the Earth around the Sun. Einstein should have withdrawn this theory. Wanting to avoid this, he claimed that temperature effects were the cause of Miller's finding. Although he had never actually looked at Miller's work, Miller told the Cleveland Plain Dealer newspaper on January 27, in 1926. Thus, Einstein's authority triumphed over reality. But the assertion of the expansion of the universe according to Lemaitre, while maintaining the theory of relativity, is based precisely on the above inequality. A scientist should have noticed such a serious contradiction in Einstein's theory. Einstein was, by the way, at the same time alive as Velikovsky, Immanuel Velikovsky. Was it about science at all, or was it about the reconciliation of science with faith? As Lemaitre formulated Pope Pius X's demand, namely that science should serve theology? Finally, in 1951, Pope Pius XII enthusiastically proclaimed Lemaitre's theory in a speech to the Pontifical Academy of Scientific Progress especially the cosmology of Big Bang, which for him was, so to speak, proof of creation, without naming the originator of the hypothesis. Even more, wouldn't the birth of the world from a primeval beginning be a proof of God? With that, to the horror of Lemaitre, who saw science and faith side by side, the germ for the growth of that we now call modern physics, namely merging of faith and science, was born into the world. Fiat lux, let there be light. At least, in one case, however you read this MEC square, blah blah blah, applies when ME is the mass of an electron, whereas the case of a stable elementary particle, the term mass loss loses its meaning. Whereas in the case of a stable elementary particle, the term mass loses its meaning. But then C and H cannot be natural constants at the same time. That would mean that the mass would be proportional to the frequency, which contradicts experience because the deep tones are produced by the large organ pipes and the high tones come from the small pipes. The same applies to the antennas. The smaller antenna, the higher frequency. From my work in precision mechanical optical device construction, I know that C is to be regarded as a material constant. So, if according to God's representative there should be light, this is not possible without the electromagnetic properties of the propagation medium, because Wilhelm Weber and Friedrich Kohlrausch discovered the relationship in 1855. So propagation speed of light is not a vector. On the other hand, particles are already moving in a certain direction. The electron has a translational speed and a rotational speed. Adding the two together, the result should not exceed the speed of light pulse radiated in all directions. Then you can write this. For the projection into translation plane and transform this expression, and thus we obtain the momentum of light quantum triggered by an electron. I have no idea what they're meaning, those things. I'm not a scientist. This means that the light quantum is spatially distributed within the medium depending on its electromagnetic density and spectrally shifted in the direction of longer and longer waves, and that Maxwell equations hold at all scales. While Planck's constant h refers to the electron as the smallest quantum of action, each massive body has its own quantum of action. If electrons oscillate in the nanometer range, then ions oscillate in the micrometer range. Radiant energy occurs as gamma rays to thermal radiation and is the driving force of the dynamics. We only perceive a small part of this spectrum as visible light. When we perceive radiation, it is always bound to moving charges, which in turn are bound to masses. So light cannot come out of nothing, as advocates of the Big Bang hypothesis claim, and space cannot expand because the number line of real numbers is dense. There are no new numbers in between. This fact should be obvious to any logically thinking person. When I look at pictures of volcanic eruption, it amazes me why dynamics is separated into mechanics, and these into point and fluid mechanics, into electrodynamics and thermodynamics, and treated in different academic principles. Why aren't astrophysicists trained in the basics of electrodynamics and thermodynamics? Why do particle physicists perhaps understand something of their mathematical tools but cannot convert their results into physically understandable knowledge? I recall that they claimed that they had found a God particle, the Higgs boson, which would transfer mass to other particles. Masses are not transferable, only impulses. Although physicists constantly operate with the terms matter and mass, they cannot distinguish between these terms. So they confuse masses with forces. They divide forces into 4 types, although forces can only be distinguished by magnitude and direction. Relativists among physicists cannot distinguish the concept of space from the concept of surface, describing 2 different qualities. For example, Earth's magnetic field. It's Earth's magnetic sphere. It's not a field, it's not two-dimensional like a field, it's you walk there and then you walk right and you walk again right and once again right and you are at the same place. It's a field. It's like, it's a 3D, it's a sphere. Sphere within spheres. It's not fields within fields. Anyway, as already mentioned, mass means nothing more than an innumerable quantity of elementary particles, whereby elementary depends on the scale of the observer. Needless to say, the scale for grain kernels is different from that for protons and electrons. Looking at Wikipedia, few people seem to know what mass really is these days. There is too much text to understand the term itself. The term is even used in particle physics, where quanta can be counted, but mass is confused with force, although moving masses act as forces. The source of the forces that move masses are the distributions of electric charges and protons and electrons, which after many years of research are still the only stable particles ever found. However, they do not appear to be spherical in shape. We must think more of them as vortices, if we want to stay compliant with electrodynamics. Birkeland currents. As Maxwell and Helmholtz perhaps suspect that all properties of matter arise from the structural variation of electric and magnetic vortices and atomic decay, as well as a fusion of atoms are electromagnetic phenomena. All structures and distributions of mass and kinetic energy are derived from this and are expressed in their fractal nature. Nature lives on dissipated energy. But physics does not yet have a unit of measure for fractality. So you can probably read the rest for yourself. I was now reading very much. Yeah. I don't know. Anyone listen to that? I don't care. There is still so much to read, so much to discover, so much to learn for everyone. Enjoy as long as you have the internet, you have electricity and the possibility to get this kind of knowledge for free. Do the best. Make the best out of it. Thanks.